Good evening. Welcome to Insights, Newcastle University's Public Lectures Programme. I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of the Public Lectures Committee. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you this evening on the loveliest day of the year to the latest of our associations with the British Academy. Please could I ensure that your phones are in a silent mode. I'm not expecting a fire alarm, so in the event of one, please join us in the car park to my left. After the lecture, there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments. And thanks to the British Academy, we have a drinks reception outside in the foyer immediately afterwards, to which you are all invited. British Academy is the UK's National Academy of the Humanities and Social Sciences. It mobilises these disciplines to understand the world and shape a brighter future. Established in 1908, the Academy's flagship lecture series showcases the very best scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. And this evening, our chair, who I'll now hand over, is Professor Neelam Srivastava, Professor of Contemporary Literature here at Postcolonial Literature, at Newcastle University. Neelam, over to you.
Hello, good evening. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Professor Tanika Sarkar, who is visiting Newcastle for the first time. Professor Sarkar's internationally recognized histories have focused on the interface of religion, politics, and women, with a particular focus on women and the role of the Hindu rite. A deeply interdisciplinary scholar, her work defies easy categorization. She is a social historian who provides a textured view of the fabric of community relations and the actions of ordinary people, but also an ethnographer who discerns larger themes underlying personal interactions and insights. She is an intellectual historian who analyzes literary and historical writings and their interpretations by contemporary political actors, as well as a scholar of women's history who captures the complexities of women's identities and the effective realm of politics. Professor Sarkar's work refuses to cordon off women's history from the broader study of power. She is currently a visiting professor at Ashoka University's Department of History, having retired as a professor in modern history at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has also held visiting professorships at Yale, Chicago, Göttingen, and the University of Witwatersrand. She has been a professorial fellow at the universities of Cambridge, Dublin, Washington, Pavia, and Centrum Moderner Oriental. Her many books include Khaki Shorts and Saffron Flags, a critique of the Hindu rite, an early comprehensive analysis of the post-independence Hindu rite when it first began entering mainstream Indian politics, Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation, Community, Religion, and Cultural Nationalism, 2001, Words to Win, a modern autobiography, a translation of the first full-length autobiography in Bengali, Amar Jiban, My Life, written in the early 19th century by an upper-caste rural housewife named Rashundari Devi. Her recent publications include Religious Nationalism in India, 2022, Caste in Bengal, Histories of Hierarchy, Exclusion, and Resistance, and Women, Gender, Religious Nationalism, 2022. In her 2021 volume, Hindu Nationalism in India, a republication of her most seminal writings, Professor Sarkar connects Hindu religious nationalism with the cultural politics of everyday India, arguing that in the 21st century, there has been a seismic shift in Indian political, religious, and social life. The inclusive Hinduism and secularist worldviews of Gandhi and Nehru have given way to Hindutva, a now dominant version of Hinduism that blends militant nationalism and the global Islamophobia of India's ruling regime. Professor Sarkar's latest book is Religion and Women in India, Gender, Faith, and Politics, 1780s to 1980s, in 2024. She shows how, throughout this 200-year history of the subcontinent, gender was not simply one of many social themes, but was constitutive of key relationships across the region's politics, economies, societies, and cultural orders. Finally, I want to mention her forthcoming Cambridge companion to Ram Mohan Roy, an important Indian intellectual and reformer who was one of the first to write in English, co-edited with Dipesh Chakrabarti and Roshinka Chaudhuri. The title of her lecture today is Neo-Brahmanism in Modern India, Reformers and Orthodoxy in the 19th Century. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tanika Sarkar.
Thank you for a very, very warm, kind, and generous introduction, perhaps too generous. And I'm immensely honored and privileged to be invited to participate in this distinguished and illustrious lecture series organized by the British Academy. It's an intimidating privilege, and you will shortly see why I am so intimidated. I'm going to present a very brief sketch of Hindu orthodoxy in 19th century India. Socio-religious conservatism is, as we know, a growing global phenomenon. So it may be of some interest to see what particular form it had assumed in a colonial context. I will use a few paradigmatic texts from Bengal in eastern India. They set the template for a wide swath of 19th century authors and readers. I will also explore how a subjugated intelligentsia chose to represent its own culture, as well as the culture of its masters. Here I confess to a major difference with several influential post-colonial and decoloniality studies scholars. These scholars argue that colonization had stripped the colonized of genuine selfhood. Henceforward, they simply echoed their master's voice. Such a perspective, I think, ironically circles back to a sort of neo-Orientalist view of the Orient. It denudes the colonized people of autonomy, and it makes them a mere figment of Western imagination. For better or for worse, though, Indians, I insist, did make their own history even under British dominion, though, of course, not under circumstances of their own choosing. So, a heated political controversy is brewing in India right now. Our ruling party forbids us to criticize Sanatan Dharma, and our Supreme Court endorses the prohibition. What then is Sanatan Dharma? The literal meaning of the term is eternal Hindu religious tradition, as embodied in scripture, the Dharma Shastra, composed by ancient Brahman, the purest caste, quote unquote, sages. Now, Hindu scripture has been remarkably variegated, ranging from skepticism to monism to monotheism to elaborate ritualism. The plurality was contracted one way or the other in the 19th century. Some intellectuals tried to tease out liberal social principles from certain ancient texts. Others preferred the normative regulations about caste, gender, worship, and ritual. They repurposed the term Sanatan Dharma to shore up a modern variant of social conservatism. And though my title says reformers and orthodoxy, I will focus on the orthodoxy. What explains the emergence of orthodox ideology? From the early 19th century, shortly after India had been colonized, a few reformers had begun to represent Hindu faith as essentially monotheist and non-idolatrous, spiritual rather than ritualistic, scripture and not custom-based. This was not altogether new or modern. From late medieval times onwards, dissident heterodox sects and popular and folk movements of various tribes had challenged Brahmanical or upper caste power, as well as the religious divisions between Hindu and Muslim. Now, strangely, all of them had been monotheist, these dissident, earlier pre-colonial sects. 19th century reformers, in contrast, were upper caste elites, very distant from popular devotional traditions. Nor did they confront, at least not initially, caste or religious sectarianism. but they added a critique of gender relations to their monotheism. By the late 19th century, a few women had joined their ranks. Reformers condemned the burning of widows on the funeral pyres of their husband, the ritual of sati. They opposed marriage of infant girls. They said widows could marry again. They said that women should have access to education, and Brahmins had no divinely ordained monopoly on sacred knowledge. So far, scriptural knowledge had been locked in Brahmanical bodies, so to speak. 20th century critics went much further. They demanded something truly stupendous, the annihilation of caste itself. No Brahmanical scripture, whether monotheist or monist, had so far challenged caste. They might have criticized this or that aspect, untouchability for instance, but not caste as a system. As political philosopher Shrudipta Kaviraj writes, Hindu religious and philosophical traditions were extraordinarily rich and diverse, but none reflected on questions of social morality or social justice. Sanatanists of the anti-reform orthodoxy furiously opposed each reformist course correction. Now, colonized Indians, I think, first sought sovereignty in the politics of the social, the familial, and the intimate over the upper caste Hindu self, much before they demanded political sovereignty. British rule helped. First promulgated in 1772, the colonial personal laws promised that their own scripture and custom would govern the social lives of the various Indian religious communities. They would be guided by their own scripture and custom. In the entire area of belief, caste, marriage, divorce, inheritance, succession, and adoption. Colonial lawmakers and judiciary had to appoint and consult modern religious specialists, Indian religious specialists in this domain. In the case of Hindus, these were Brahman Pandits. Indians, reformers and orthodoxy alike, therefore sought to redesign their social, religious, and familial worlds with quite a large degree of freedom, though always bending fragments of scripture to make their case. Lacking control over the state form, they chose to leave that alone, although Ram Mohan Roy, the first Hindu reformer, did demand greater transparency and accountability in state action. As I said just now, I will focus on orthodoxy. There's a reason for that. The history of modern Indian orthodoxy happens to be surprisingly under-researched. Historians generally represent them as a residual group of traditional scholars and priests, sad misfits in the strange new world of colonial modernity, kind of clueless, anchorless people drifting around. Actually, until the end of the 19th century and much beyond, they ruled the Hindu social world with a firm hand, and they may well do so again. They were different from pre-modern orthopraxy. Orthopraxy, when Brahmanical prescriptions had comfortably governed the social world, their authority very seldom challenged. The 19th century, in sharp contrast, plunged into massive controversies about them, and this denaturalized the sacred injunctions, even if they could not cancel them. So, orthodox hegemony did survive, but it was now put at risk. It had to find a new language to confront its adversaries. It needed a modern self-image. It found it, I would argue, in a freshly minted aesthetic of the upper caste Hindu self. No binary distinction separated the adversaries, orthodox and reformist. All were upper caste, all well versed in Hindu scripture. We make a distinction, usually reformists were anglicized, whereas the orthodox were traditionalists. No such thing. Both were quite cosmopolitan, both were deeply immersed in Hindu scripture. Both sides included Brahmin Pandits as well as modern cosmopolitans. Both were loyal to colonial rule despite the occasional criticism, and both agreed on the need for modern education for upper caste men. Both subsisted on government services, usury, money lending, landholding, expropriating the surplus that peasants produced. The commonalities, in fact, were so strong that we may run the risk of ignoring their real and radical divergences. The debates began in the early 19th century around a ritual called Sati Pratha, that of burning widows on the funeral pyres of their husbands, and castes which buried their dead also buried their widows alive. Never compulsory, it was nonetheless lauded with warm exuberance by most scriptural texts, at least from the 3rd century CE. The text promised her and her husband millions of years in heaven. In the early 19th century, Pandits, prodded by the state, had suggested a few minor restrictions on the practice, all according to scripture. The orthodoxy recoiled in horror, and I cite a very significant sentence from a petition they sent to the state in protest. I quote, "Hindu widows perform of their own accord and pleasure the sacrifice of self-immolation, which is not merely a sacred duty, but a high privilege to her who believes in the doctrine of her religion." What does this sentence do? The widow going to burn had so far followed a prefabricated sacred script, composed by ancient Brahmin scholars and enforced in the present by Brahmin priests who promised her untold heavenly rewards. It was emphatically not a script of her own making. The sentence I just quoted, in contrast, transfers the responsibility for the burnings entirely to her will and accord. It reverses the source of agency from scripture to the woman's supposedly independent decision. She is now the origin and the ground of the ritual act. Second, the indubitable pain of burning to death is transfigured as her pleasure. Third, she is no longer just the ritual performer, the sati. She is now a much larger figure, the defender of her faith, no less. Finally, the reformists seeking to protect her from death had tried to render her into something like a rights-bearing person with an absolute right to live. The orthodoxy, on the other hand, valued her as a culture-bearing person. Radhakanto Deb led the orthodox campaign in defense of immolations. A high caste intellectual, befriended by colonial officials and European Indologists, he was a polymath, learned in several European languages, as well as in Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian. A justice of peace and honorary magistrate of Calcutta, he had received a high-powered title from the Governor-General Bentinck, even though he opposed Bentinck's decision to abolish immolations. His monumental Sanskrit encyclopedic lexicon, Shabdakalpadrum, brought him enormous global accolade. From the Asiatic Societies of Paris, Copenhagen, from the German Oriental Society, the American Oriental Society, the Imperial Academy of Sciences at St. Petersburg, the Royal Academy of Sciences at Berlin. He was also an office holder of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Conservatives were well-regarded figures in colonial circles as well as in the Western intellectual world. He wrote the first classic text for modern orthodoxy, an apology for the present system of Hindu worship. It was a powerful defense of caste polytheism, image worship, and the attendant retinue of temples and Brahmin priests. Plus, and a very important plus, the countless customary injunctions on everyday conduct. These, he said, are not trivial or incidental accretions. These are the real heart of faith. Transcendentalist or monotheistic versions of Hindu theology, in contrast, were of minor or no importance. The book renewed unconditional commitment to the existing scriptural and customary social usage, relationships, and ritual practice. It protected them against intrusions from modern knowledge, reason, moral reflection. Hindu ethic is particularistic, non-universalizable, he suggested. No alliance can be possible with extrinsic values. Our ancestors had followed the time-hallowed sacred norms whose truth we cannot begin to fathom, our modern understanding being thinner and lacking in the depth and density that their accumulated ancient wisdom contains. Present sensibilities and reason must therefore yield to the past authorities. Second, he elevated ritual and customary practice over religious knowledge. Reformer Ram Mohan Roy had advocated monotheism and condemned widow immolations. Radhakanto did not dispute Ram Mohan's mastery over Sanskrit scripture, not his knowledge, but he called attention to his consumption of forbidden food and drink, his alleged relationship with a Muslim woman. Ram Mohan's conduct sufficed to disqualify his arguments. It also disqualified him as a Hindu. And I quote from Radhakanto, "Transgress not the religion of your forefathers, but rely on the authority of the sages, and shape your practice accordingly. Rules of injunction prohibition are superior to ultimate knowledge meaning religious knowledge. Rules of injunction prohibition are superior to ultimate knowledge." So practice becomes all. And let me cite another example of its power. Henry Vivian de Rosio was a brilliant young faculty member at Hindu College, a center of modern learning in the British imperial city of Calcutta. He encouraged a group of free thinkers to live according to their moral principles and reason, and not to compromise. Demanding de Rosio's dismissal from the college, they wrote to a senior British official, and I'm citing from this letter at some length, "It has been reported to me that the conduct of the students," see how this word keeps reverberating, "conduct of the students is inconsistent with the laws and usages of our caste, that in direct prohibition of caste dictates, they not only eat and drink prohibited articles," and he named them pastries and kachoris, which are something like samosas. They not only eat and drink prohibited articles with Mohammedans and Christians, they are also guilty of fornication and sodomy. I beg to propose that the offenders be immediately removed altogether from the institution as well as their teacher. To the ideas of the Europeans, he went on to say, eating and drinking promiscuously with Indians of a different sect conveys no reproach, whereas to the Hindu, a transgression of that nature is in the highest degree revolting and sinful, and involves the forfeiture of caste. Nor should Christian and Muslim students be admitted to the college. Practice, we should note, is stored entirely in the body, in its dispositions, in its conformity to caste-based purity pollution taboos, in its ingestion habits, in its sexual orientation. But there was something else too. Radhakanto is not interested at all in castigating any other faith or community. Leave our practices intact, that's all I want, he seemed to say. Nor does he manufacture anything like a civilizational hierarchy where Hindus occupy the top rung. He's not saying that our injunctions are superior to everybody else's. He's simply saying they are ours, so we should follow them. Religions for him, nor does he manufacture a civilizational hierarchy where Hindus occupy the top rung. Religions for him are adjacently, not hierarchically placed, but their boundaries must be strictly policed. His is a conservationist conservatism, not a competitive or combative one. His persuasion carried the day, and the British college authorities promptly sacked de Rosio. The sanctity of the upper caste Hindu body was duly respected, not only by Hindu society, but also by British officials on the college trust. Orthodox tonality changed significantly from the mid-19th century, and I now refer to certain aspects of the new material and social context to explain the shift. Segments of early 19th century high caste Bengali Hindus, reformist and orthodoxy alike, had profited considerably from the imperial connection. Some became independent entrepreneurs in the nascent capitalist regime. Most gained enormously from the colonial revenue laws. They had not yet comprehended the devastating material changes that colonialism portended. To them, the British merely replaced one non-Hindu rule with another. Indigenous capitalist efforts, however, collapsed by mid-century. Land ownership was slightly modified by later agrarian laws, which granted a modicum of protection to the tenant cultivator. Far more seriously, the early 1870s saw a spate of peasant revolts against landlords. And worst of all, a low-caste monotheistic religious movement emerged to challenge polytheism, priestly authority, as well as upper caste landlord power. The last few decades of the century were, therefore, a profoundly unsettling conjuncture. If the earlier loss of capitalist opportunities had been partially mitigated by elite power over peasants and low caste, now their authority in the rural moral economy too was seriously troubled. What remained of their unchallenged hegemony, therefore, seemed to shrink into the realm of the domestic, into their absolute mastery over their own women. And it was precisely here that they faced their worst nightmare. For widow burnings were already abolished, widow remarriage legalized, along with a civil marriage law. Reformers were educating women, and women themselves had begun to publish stinging critiques of Hindu domestic discipline. From the 1860s, quite a few women from orthodox households described homes as places of immense danger and pain. Some congratulated the British rulers for subjugating Indian men who had subjugated Indian women far longer. Pandita Ramabai converted to her own version of Christianity, having written a bitter denunciation of Hindu gender. A well-knit marriage structure had so far governed the upper castes. Non-consensual and endogamous, that is no intercaste or interfaith marriage, and indissoluble, that is no divorce, it had allowed unlimited male polygamy. Female monogamy, in contrast, was absolute even for widows. Ambitious low-caste fractions were appropriating these norms over time. The whole structure now came under an enormous question mark. There was an alternative route which the orthodoxy could have taken. For this was a time when colonial racism, repression, and catastrophic economic exploitation had reached new peaks, and several important anti-colonial political and economic critiques had started to appear. But the orthodoxy chose not to tread that path. They attached their defense of Hindu caste and gender exclusively to a culture war, waged against the supposed Western cultural and intellectual inadequacies. And with that, end-century orthodoxy morphed into cultural nationalism, anti-colonial, but purely on cultural grounds. In 1890-91, the state had criminalized sexual intercourse with wives under 12. The law was made after an 11-year-old girl, brutally raped by her husband, had died in horrible agony. Cultural nationalists organized massive street protests against the new law, the first of their kind in the history of Indian politics. Their language of protest became frankly abusive. By the late 19th century, they had created a new literary genre which was didactic as well as pleasurable. Do I have 15 more minutes? I see two distinct strands here. One was the work of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, brilliant polemicist scholar, and the first major Indian novelist. A highly sophisticated cosmopolitan intellectual, a great devotee of John Stuart Mill, he was sorely troubled by the long history of Hindu military defeats at the hands of non-Hindus, first Muslims, then the British. Seeking redemption for such perceived deficit in Hindu masculinity, he constructed images of historical or imagined Hindu heroes, courageously opposing Muslim rulers alone. His fictional Brahmin leaders follow a rigorous regime of celibacy. They are well versed in the classical Sanskrit texts. Combining the qualities of the Brahmin and the warrior, they grow into a band of dedicated ascetic warrior heroes, leaders of the future Hindu nation. Wars, however, need not just heroes but also adversaries, and Bankim left a momentous legacy for our subsequent political literature. His novel Anandamot 1880s constructed the Muslim as necessary sacrifice to a goddess of the motherland who demands Muslim blood to recover her lost splendor. This goddess was Bankim's own invention, a brand new addition to the Hindu theogony, and summoned solely for the purpose of unleashing violence against Muslims. The leader sounds a rallying cry, and I quote from the novel, "Brothers, when will we demolish Muslim mosques to build temples? When will we smash the pigsties they live in? When will we ground them into the dust?" and so on and so forth. Old images cast long shadows, and very recently, 22nd January 2024, a spectacular temple was indeed inaugurated on the site of what used to be a 16th century mosque. That Babri Masjid had earlier been demolished by Hindu militants amidst great violence. That was one strand, but there was a second strand too. The late 19th century also saw a non-combative aesthetic and ethic from the Brahman self, which represented Muslims as friends, not foes. I will focus on two important texts by Bhudev Mukhopadhyay and Chandranath Bosu, high caste men, thoroughly trained in Western philosophy, literature, history, and very well placed in the superior ranks of the colonial bureaucracy. Their writings exhibited a curious literary amalgam, replete with learned references to Western intellectual, political, and cultural texts, citing from Hindu scripture, retelling stories from epics and myths, which are intercut with personal anecdotes. These disconnected sources flow smoothly into one another. Together, they construct the scaffolding for an entire structure of deeply conservative socio-familial values. Though certainly less than Hindus in every respect, Muslims, they said, are considerably superior to the British, because over the years they have imbibed high caste Hindu virtues. Their widows no longer marry again, and their daughters no longer possess the inheritance rights which Islam had originally granted them. They do eat meat, unfortunately, but not as prodigiously as the Western people. So Hindu influence has civilized them. Primarily, though, they provide extremely detailed instructions on the proper conduct of upper caste quotidian lives. They lace the vast, complex, labyrinthine, customary, and ritual regulations with great aesthetic appeal, emotional intensity, and spiritual content, as well as scientific, quote-unquote, scientific justification for the prescriptions. Now, Bhudev did criticize global Western aggressions, and he did so amply with considerable accuracy and prescience. But that was not his chief target. Moreover, he blamed Western aggression not on Western lust for conquest nor on the capitalist greed for global resources. He laid the blame squarely on Western liberal principles, on the concept of the disembedded individual will, on the politics of universalizable rights. Their doctrine of formal rights and equal opportunities is false, he said, because humans are born unequal, and they must ideally remain so. A very strange thing for a colonized Indian to talk against equality. Equally false is the theory of social contract, which obliges the monarch to embody the general will of the people. Hindu monarchs had always been caring and benevolent. Monarchical absolutism flourished peacefully in ancient India. Political revolutions were unheard of, and compromise with the general will was therefore entirely unnecessary. The Western creed of individualism had unleashed social and moral anarchy in the world. Western religion lacks spiritual content. Western marriage, based on the self-choice of adults, is gross sensuality. Western family life is bereft of love. Western men are soulless. They even lack a sense of personal hygiene. Western women are shameless and brash. Massive consumption of animal flesh has made them violent and lustful. Now, this may sound like crude invective, but it was actually couched in erudite, seemingly thoughtful language. Summing it all up, they said, the Western self is made of base metal, and they used a Hindu term, ghor tamoshik, dark, impure qualities that characterize the low-caste Hindus, the Shudras, also mark the Western people. A typically Brahmanical contempt for low castes leached into their descriptions of the West. They were the new Shudras. The Hindu social form they argued, shines in contrast. It is godlike in its perfection. At the same time, they did not want an end to British rule. Harm, they said, comes from within the Hindu community, from the Hindu reformers who had abandoned Sanatan Dharma. There was a hidden subtext behind their onslaught on Western political and social principles. From mid and late 19th century, a few low-caste reformers like Jyotiba Phule had begun to castigate the Brahmins' power over low castes as an instance of the master-slave relationship. The orthodoxy needed to build a solid fortress of counter-arguments around Brahmanical absolutism. Caste, they said, is above all a religious principle, and the doctrine of karma explains why the world is as it is. For Hindus know that our present fate is decided by our action in our past birth, and our future will be decided by our present action. Such a belief offers the most comprehensive reconciliation with reality. Hindus do not rail against nor seek to change what may seem undeserved good or bad fortune in the present. As Max Weber would later say, karma provides the most foolproof form of theodicy, justification for good and bad fortunes, which otherwise seem inexplicable. Hindu society is devoid of competition and conflict because each caste, so they claimed, works for all others in their different capacities, which are divided according to hereditary competence. Hierarchy is the lifeblood of the Hindu social system. The formidable sacred taboos against intercaste dining and marriage, against the touching of quote-unquote impure low-caste bodies by quote-unquote pure ones, actually preserve the racial, and they use the word racial very often, distinctiveness of each caste. Sanatan Dharma, they said, has 3 layers. The apex is theology, which the Brahman man alone can learn. The middle part is its distinctive social ethic of caste. The third consists of the infinitely detailed regulatory regime that frames the Hindu everyday. It elaborates the primary life cycle rites. It decides who can eat what and when, what are the auspicious and inauspicious signs and times, what is pure and what is not, and to what degree pure or impure, what to touch and what to avoid, how much distance to be observed from what and whom, what are the penalties for infractions, all this in the minutest detail. The edifice unravels even if a single minor element is disturbed. Hindu perfection is total, but it is also precarious. Unlike Bankim Chandra's ascetic warriors, their Brahmins are not renunciates nor militants. They are devout householders. The Hindu household is the foundation and the school of Hindu righteousness. Love and peace, they claim, perpetually wash over the Hindu world. Love for the family grows into love for society, which enlarges into community care and then overflows to embrace the world. At its peak, it becomes the most marvelous love for God. They explain why the Brahman man alone is vested with social guardianship. The prescribed 4 stages of the Brahman male life cycle produce the ideal human. The young student practices celibacy. Thoroughly trained in self-restraint, he then enters the household to marry, produce sons, and procure material possessions. Having done his duty to household and society, the elderly man retires into the forest. He ends life as a renunciate. A single lifetime, therefore, endows him with all the experiences life can offer, which in turn imparts incomparable spiritual richness. He alone is thus the perfect custodian for the community. Every aspect of Hindu marriage had to be strenuously elaborated, justified, idealized, and beautified, because the unkindest cut of all had been delivered by their own Hindu women. So they set about it. Unlike the preponderance of the gross carnal desires of Western people, Hindu conjugal love, they say, is strictly devoid of the taint of sexual desire. They refer to a scriptural adage, Putrarthe kriyate bharya, marriage is just meant to produce sons. Sons are precious family jewels. They perpetuate the family line, they nurture ancestral spirits, they augment family piety and fortune. They are a bridge among generations. Conjugality, however, comes before procreation, and they described an ideal type for it. Married love has to be founded on mandatory child marriage for the woman. The Hindu bride must be prepubescent, preferably an infant, to ensure total innocence and purity of her body and mind. Because otherwise, with the onset of puberty, the female mind invariably fills up with sinful sexual desire. She must be married off earlier than that. She must not think of, look at, speak to, or even mention the name of another man outside the closest relatives, outside the circle of closest relatives. Nor should she seek education, nor even literacy. Knowledge, for her, resides in her selfless service to her husband, to the household. Patrilocality is yet another essential condition. It uproots the bride from her natal family at infancy, so as to integrate her more thoroughly with the matrimonial one. Abandoning even the memory of her natal family, the child pours all her love, her commitment into her new relatives, above all towards her husband, who's her guru, her living God. And I quote from Chandranath Boshu, "The best time to cage an animal is when it is a cub." He adds that, I quote, "Non-Hindus will find the animal metaphor humiliating, but the Hindu woman knows better. She genuinely considers herself as less than dust in relation to her husband. She knows the woman's greatest privilege and happiness comes from being his property. Based on willed self-subordination, her love for her husband entirely absorbs the wife, as much in his lifetime as after his death." Liberal reformers had introduced a new social imperative, a few immutable rights for the woman, to live, to education, to remarriage. Orthodoxy and cultural nationalists annexed this quote-unquote disruptive possibility to their own discourse by shifting the ground of the regulations, from sacred injunctions to the woman's own desire, burning desire for subordination. They added caste to the discourse, applying the same logic. But there were differences between the two phases. Radhakanto had insisted on the radical difference between Hindus and others. But his was a non-evaluative defensive stance. Bhudeb and Chandranath, in contrast, strenuously elevated the Hindu above the West, inventing a civilizational ladder where Hindus occupied an Olympian height, Muslims were placed on the second rung, and the West had to cling to the bottom. For Radhakanto, scripture and custom had been their own justification. They needed no additional defense. He does not develop an ethic for them. This is what scripture says, so they must be obeyed. His generation did not need to explain the logic of their mandate, nor try to excavate a moral content for them. But by end century, that clearly was not enough. Bhudeb and Chandranath had to construct labored arguments to justify why inequality was non-negotiable, why authority must lie with the Brahman, with ancestors and priests, with fathers and husbands. And why authority must be absolute. Finally, and most significantly, they rewrote the relations of power as acts of love. They translated the Hindu disciplinary regime as tenderness. They transfigured radical inequality as exquisite beauty, tranquility, fulfillment, and pleasure, as much for the dominant as for the subordinate. They endowed the new Brahmanical self-image with perfect hegemony, tempting and interpellating modern Hindus into authoritarianism in the gentlest possible way. Strong echoes persist in today's militant Hindu nationalist texts, Hindutva texts, which have taken self-adoration to new heights. We are the Vishwa Guru, Guru to the world, with the difference that the contemporary Hindu militant is an aggressive Islamophobe as well, closer to Bankim's fiction. Now, in conclusion, you may ask, what is so unique to Hindu orthodoxy? Pocock, Underdown, and many others have shown similar patterns in the writings of early modern English conservatives. Let me therefore flag a few significant divergences. First, I spoke of voices raised in a colonial context and raised against specific aspects of perceived Western political and cultural habits. In the face of these interventions, Western interventions, Indian reformist interventions, Hindu orthodoxy repeatedly defined and redefined itself throughout the 19th century. The difference of purpose endowed a different content and a distinctive individuality to their efforts. And English conservatives, whereas English conservatives described an arc or formed a linked chain that began with the household and went up to the state, where the family was a microcosm of the state, Indian orthodoxy bypassed the state altogether. Family, household, and caste were their alternative universe, insulated entirely from state action. We have long been familiar with the destructive power of colonial myths about the colonized. These orthodox constructions were partly a reaction of the colonized, perhaps a legitimate reaction, which need to reverse the colonial descriptive terms and return the contempt of the colonizer in full measure to harvest self-respect. But still, the discursive thrust, the polemical purpose, is not opposition to colonial racism and politics. The primary intention is to consolidate their own power over women and low castes, to achieve an internal colonization within the folds of the colonial regime. We Indians tend to overlook the relations of power inside our own societies that nested within colonial rule. They are, I think, potentially more hegemonic because they are our own. Thank you.